Welcome to Explore English Podcast. My name is Jack, and today, I want to tell you a story that might completely change how you see your life. Have you ever felt like time is moving too fast? You wake up, check your phone, hurry to work, and before you know it, another year has passed. A few years ago, I was caught in that exact same trap. I was working endless hours, constantly stressed, and losing connection with the things that truly mattered. But then, on a quiet, foggy Tuesday morning in a small coastal town in Maine, an unexpected encounter with a mysterious elderly man named Arthur changed everything. He handed me a faded leather notebook with a single rule: never turn the page until you fully understand the lesson in front of you. Today, we are going to walk through those forgotten pages together. Listen closely, relax, and let every single word sink deep into your mind. The Quiet Cafe in Maine. It was the middle of October. The air in coastal Maine was cold, crisp, and smelled of ocean salt and burning pine wood. The leaves on the trees had turned brilliant shades of deep red, burnt orange, and bright gold. Every morning, before the rest of the town woke up, I would walk down to a tiny cafe near the harbor called the Anchor and Bean. It was warm inside, filled with the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, toasted cinnamon bagels, and old paper. I used to sit near the back window, watching the fishing boats disappear into the morning mist. On most days, I brought my laptop. I would answer emails, read news articles, and scroll through social media. My mind was always spinning. I was physically present in the cafe, but mentally, I was miles away, worrying about tomorrow or regretting yesterday. That was the day I first noticed Arthur. Arthur was an older gentleman, probably in his late 70s. He wore a heavy wool sweater, thick brown boots, and a gray cap. What made Arthur different from everyone else in the cafe was simple: he did nothing. He did not have a phone. He did not have a laptop. He did not even read a newspaper. He simply sat by the fireplace with a warm mug of dark coffee held between his hands, looking out the window with absolute calm. For 3 days straight, I saw him sit in that exact same spot for an hour every morning. On the fourth day, the cafe was unusually crowded. The only open seat was the small wooden chair directly across from Arthur's table. I walked over and asked if anyone was sitting there while holding my notebook and a fresh cup of coffee. Arthur looked up with clear, light blue eyes, smiled softly, and told me that the seat was all mine and invited me to sit down. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began typing frantically. But after 10 minutes, the sound of my own mechanical keyboard felt noisy and aggressive compared to the gentle silence Arthur created around him. I stopped typing and looked up. Arthur was watching the rain begin to fall against the glass. Without turning his head, Arthur remarked in a deep, smooth voice that I was moving very fast. I was caught off guard and asked him what he meant. He turned to face me and explained that while my body was sitting in that warm chair, my mind was running a marathon. Then he asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks: if I spend my entire life rushing to the next moment, when do I actually get to live this one? I paused. I had never mentioned my name to him, but perhaps the barista had said it out loud when handing me my drink. Still, his question hit me with surprising force. I closed my laptop halfway and replied that I just had a lot to do because life moves fast nowadays. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. The cover was worn at the edges and bound with a dark leather strap. He placed it gently on the wooden table between us and told me that life only moves as fast as we allow it to. He explained that the notebook contained 12 stories collected over 78 years of living, traveling, losing, and discovering. Every story held a truth that most people discover far too late. He said he wanted me to read them, but I had to promise to read slowly, without rushing to finish, allowing the words to breathe in my mind. The Clockmaker's Secret. The first story in Arthur's notebook began in a small village in Vermont during the winter of 1965. In that village, there lived a master clockmaker named Thomas. Thomas was known throughout the region for creating the most accurate, beautiful grandfather clocks in the state. People traveled from far away just to buy a clock from his workshop. His clocks did not just tell time. They were works of art carved from solid walnut and mahogany, with brass pendulums that swung with perfect, soothing rhythmic precision. One afternoon, a young businessman from New York City entered Thomas's shop. The businessman was wearing an expensive suit and looked at his pocket watch every 30 seconds. He wanted to buy a clock, but he had a strange request. He paced back and forth across the wooden floorboards and said that he wanted to purchase the finest clock, but he needed Thomas to modify it so the pendulum would swing twice as fast. Thomas stopped his work, set down his tiny screwdriver, looked over his magnifying spectacles, and asked why on earth anyone would want a clock that ticks twice as fast. The businessman replied impatiently that time is money, and if the clock ticks faster, it will remind him to move faster, work harder, and achieve his goals quicker because efficiency is everything in the city. Thomas smiled gently and walked over to a grand, dark walnut clock standing tall in the corner. He opened the glass door and stopped the swinging pendulum with his hand. The steady tick-tock sound immediately ceased, leaving the room in complete silence. Thomas explained to the young man that forcing a clock to tick twice as fast does not give a person more hours in the day, it simply wears out the gears twice as fast. The springs snap, the wood warps, and the beauty of the movement is lost. He noted that a good clock does not teach us to rush, but reminds us that every single second is steady, precious, and unrepeatable. The businessman stood silent for a moment. He looked at the perfectly crafted brass gears inside the clock. For the first time all day, his shoulders dropped, and he took a long, deep breath before buying the standard clock, untouched and unchanged. Arthur's note at the bottom of the page read, "We often believe that by doing things faster, we are living more. But speed often blurs the picture. True clarity requires slowness." As I finished reading the entry, I looked up from the leather notebook. The rain outside the coffee shop window had softened into a gentle drizzle. The harbor was calm, reflecting the gray sky like a polished mirror. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to just sit and absorb a moment without needing to produce something, check a screen, or plan the future. The Cabin in the Woods. The second chapter of the notebook took place deep in the mountains of Colorado. Arthur had written this entry when he was 35 years old, during a time when he felt completely overwhelmed by his career and personal responsibilities. He had decided to rent an isolated wooden cabin far away from the city for 2 full weeks. There was no electricity, no telephone line, and no neighbors for miles around. The only source of heat was a stone fireplace in the living room, and the only source of light at night was oil lamps and candles. On his first night in the cabin, Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of anxiety. The silence was deafening. Without the constant hum of city traffic, the buzzing of refrigerator motors, or the background noise of radios, his own thoughts felt uncomfortably loud. He found himself pacing up and down the pine floorboards, unable to sit still. He realized how addicted his brain had become to constant stimulation. When noise was removed, he was left alone with his inner voice, and that inner voice was full of unspoken worries, unaddressed fears, and restless energy. By the third day, however, something remarkable happened. The silence stopped feeling threatening, it began to feel peaceful. Every morning, Arthur had to cut firewood with an axe. It was hard, physical labor. He had to carry heavy logs, stack them against the cabin wall, and build a fire to keep warm and cook his food. At first, he hated the chore because it felt tedious and exhausting. But gradually, he began to notice the small details of the task. He noticed the sharp, fresh smell of pine wood as the axe split the logs. He noticed the steady rhythm of his breathing and the strength returning to his arms. He noticed the warm glow of the flames catching the dry timber. What used to feel like a tedious chore had transformed into a form of meditation. Because he was forced to focus entirely on the physical reality of the moment, his mental stress began to melt away. One evening, while sitting by the fire listening to the wind rustling through the towering Douglas fir trees outside, Arthur wrote in his journal that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of space. When we clear away the constant noise of modern life, we finally create space for deep thoughts, genuine creativity, and real peace to emerge. Most people fear quiet moments because it exposes what is missing inside, but if you sit with the quiet long enough, it shows you what is truly important. Reading these words in the warm coffee shop, I felt a deep sense of resonance. In our modern world, we fill every tiny gap in our day with noise. We listen to podcasts while cooking, watch videos while eating, and scroll through social media while standing in line at the grocery store. We rarely give our minds a single moment of true rest. The Old Painter and the Unfinished Canvas. Arthur's third entry brought me to a dusty art studio in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The story was about an elderly painter named Elena, who had spent over 5 years working on a single canvas. The painting depicted a desert landscape at sunset, with vast sandstone cliffs rising against a sky of deep violet and gold. Friends, art collectors, and gallery owners often visited her studio, marveling at the detail in the work. But everyone always asked why it took so many years on one painting when she could paint dozens in that time. Elena would always set down her brush, wipe her hands on her paint-stained apron, and explain that a painting is not finished when you run out of canvas or paint, but when it has said everything it needs to say. Every layer of paint needs time to dry, to settle, and to interact with the layer beneath it. Rushing the process only makes the colors muddy and destroys the depth. She observed that modern culture had become obsessed with output, with how many things a person could produce, make, or sell in the shortest amount of time. But true art, depth, and character take time to develop. You cannot rush the growth of an oak tree, and you cannot rush the depth of a human soul. Arthur had noted below Elena's words. We spend so much time trying to reach destinations, complete projects, and cross finish lines that we forget that the real transformation happens during the process. Life is not a product to be completed, it is a canvas to be painted layer by layer, day by day. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the imagery settle in my mind. How many times had I rushed through an experience just to check it off my to-do list? How often had I traveled to a new place only to take a few photos and move on to the next location, without ever stopping to smell the air, listen to the language, or talk to the locals? The journey across the country. The story continued as Arthur described a long journey he took across the United States by train in his late 20s. He had boarded the train in Chicago, traveling all the way to San Francisco. In those days, long-distance train travel was slow. The journey took days as the train rolled across the vast, flat cornfields of the Midwest, climbed through the dramatic, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, and crossed the dry, sun-baked deserts of Nevada. Arthur recalled sitting in the observation car, watching the landscape shift slowly outside the large glass windows. At first, he felt restless because the train felt too slow, and he wished he could arrive in San Francisco immediately. But as the miles turned into hundreds, he began to talk with his fellow passengers. He spoke with an elderly woman returning to her childhood home after 40 years away. He shared a meal with a young mechanic who was moving westward to start his own business. He listened to a musician playing acoustic guitar quietly in the corner of the dining car as the sun set over the plains. Each person had a story, along with unique struggles, hopes, and memories. Because the train moved slowly, the passengers had time to connect deeply. There were no screens to distract them, only conversation, shared meals, and the passing scenery. By the time the train finally pulled into the station in San Francisco, Arthur realized that the destination was almost secondary. The true magic of the trip had been the conversations, the slow reflections, and the deep sense of connection he had built with strangers along the track. Arthur wrote that when you travel at high speed, you only see the outlines of the world, but when you travel slowly, you see the texture, the colors, and the faces. The art of listening. As I turned another page of the notebook, the focus shifted toward human relationships. This chapter was titled The Rare Gift of Attention. Arthur wrote about an experience he had while working as a high school English teacher in a small town. He noticed that many of his students struggled not because they lacked intelligence, but because they felt unheard. In their busy households, surrounded by noisy televisions and distracted parents, no one ever gave them focused, undivided attention. Arthur decided to try an experiment in his classroom called Quiet Voices. Once a week, a student would stand in front of the class and share a personal story or thought that mattered to them while the rest of the class sat in total silence. No one was allowed to interrupt or offer advice until the speaker was completely done. At first, the teenagers found it uncomfortable because they were used to interrupting or letting their eyes wander. But within a few weeks, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Shy students began to speak with remarkable confidence, while loud students learned to sit quietly and listen with respect. Arthur noted that listening to someone slowly and completely, without interrupting or planning a reply, is one of the highest forms of respect you can offer another human being. Listening is not just hearing words, it is holding space for someone else's experience. This was a powerful realization for me. I thought back to my own conversations with friends and family. How often was I truly listening versus merely waiting for my turn to speak? Listening requires slowness and quieting our internal dialogue so we can truly hear others. The garden in the city. Another page took me to a small community garden nestled between towering concrete skyscrapers in the heart of Chicago. Arthur described an elderly woman named Maria, who tended a modest patch of vegetables and flowers in the middle of the noisy city. Sirens screamed down the streets nearby and construction cranes groaned overhead, yet inside the garden, Maria moved with deliberate, quiet grace. She spent hours pulling weeds by hand, turning the rich dark soil, and watering rows of green lettuce, red tomatoes, and tall yellow sunflowers. When Arthur asked her why she spent so much time on such a small garden in the middle of a chaotic metropolis, Maria smiled and explained that plants do not care about city schedules. You cannot tell a tomato plant to grow faster because you have a busy week ahead. A seed needs water, sunlight, and time. Working in the soil reminded her that nature operates on a different clock than human ambition. Arthur wrote below this passage, "Nature never hurries, yet everything is accomplished. Trees do not rush to grow their leaves, flowers do not scramble to open their petals before their time." When we align our internal pace with the patient rhythms of nature, we find a sense of peace that no fast-paced success can ever provide. The lost craft of handcrafted things. As I continued reading through Arthur's notebook, each story added another layer of depth to the central message. One entry detailed his visit to a small workshop in Maine where an old craftsman named Caleb made wooden boats entirely by hand. Caleb spent up to 2 years building a single wooden canoe. He shaved the planks with hand tools, fitting them together with incredible precision so that no water could penetrate the seams. Arthur asked Caleb if he ever considered using modern power tools or synthetic materials to speed up the process and make more money. Caleb shook his head and said that using fast materials might allow him to make 10 boats in the time it takes to make one, but those boats would have no soul and end up in a landfill in 10 years. However, a boat built by hand with patience and respect for the wood will last 100 years and carry generations across clear lakes. Some things are worth taking time for. This concept of durability versus speed resonated deeply within me. So much of what we consume today is disposable, cheap clothes, fast food, and quick digital media that we forget immediately. But the things that bring deep, lasting satisfaction, like mastery of a skill or deep friendships, cannot be mass-produced. They require handcrafted effort over time. The value of unhurried conversation. The next section of the notebook reflected on the power of unhurried human connection. Arthur recalled an evening he spent in a small village on the coast of Ireland many years prior. He had walked into a cozy pub on a stormy evening, looking for warmth and a good meal. The pub was filled with locals sitting around a roaring peat fire. There was no television playing. Just the sound of rain against the window, the crackle of the fire, and the rich hum of human voices telling stories. An elderly Irishman named Sean invited Arthur to sit by the hearth. They began talking, starting with simple topics like the weather and travel, before moving into deeper discussions about life choices, regrets, and family memories. The conversation lasted for 4 hours without anyone checking the time. Sean said something that night that Arthur wrote down in bold letters. A conversation should not be a race to make a point. It should be a warm room where both people can sit down and rest. Modern communication is often reduced to short text messages or brief bullet points in emails. We exchange information constantly, but we rarely exchange real human warmth. Unhurried conversation allows us to see beyond the surface of a person and cultivate real empathy. Learning to appreciate simple moments. The final pages of the notebook contain short, reflective entries written over several decades of Arthur's life. They were observations of daily life that most people overlook. A rainy Sunday afternoon spent reading a book by the window, while the aroma of vegetable soup simmers slowly on the stove. Walking through a forest path in early autumn, listening to the dry leaves crunching softly underfoot. Sitting on a wooden porch early in the morning, holding a hot mug of coffee and watching the fog rise off the lake. Watching an old friend smile at a memory shared 30 years ago. Arthur wrote that the most beautiful experiences in life rarely cost anything or require extraordinary wealth. They simply require presence, opening our eyes, slowing down our steps, and paying attention to the gentle beauty hidden in ordinary moments. The Old Fisherman's Net. Turning past the short entries, I found a story Arthur had recorded during a summer spent in a sleepy fishing village in Nova Scotia. It was about an old fisherman named Daniel, who had spent over 50 years navigating the cold Atlantic waters. Every afternoon, after bringing his catch to the docks, Daniel would sit on a wooden bench near the shoreline, meticulously repairing his nets. The nets were massive, woven from thick cord, and were constantly being torn by sharp rocks, heavy tides, or jagged underwater debris. Daniel would spend hours untangling knots, threading thick needles, and carefully mending each torn section by hand. One day, a young tourist walked by and noticed how much time Daniel spent working on the exact same net day after day. The tourist paused and suggested that it would be far more efficient to throw the damaged net away and buy a brand new nylon net online. He pointed out that time spent repairing old things was time wasted, time that could be spent catching more fish or resting. Daniel did not look up immediately. He finished tightening a thick square knot with his weathered, salt-stained hands before turning his eyes toward the ocean. He explained that a new net is light and convenient, but an old net knows the water. Every knot in the net represented a storm survived, a heavy catch brought ashore, or a quiet morning on the water. Mending the net was not just about fixing a tool, it was a daily ritual of gratitude and respect for the sea. If a person discards everything the moment it develops a tear, they end up living in a world made entirely of cheap, disposable things that carry no story, no strength, and no history. Arthur wrote below Daniel's reflection, "We live in a culture that encourages us to throw away anything that breaks, our tools, our belongings, and even our relationships. But true strength is found in the willingness to sit down, untangle the knots, and mend the tears. A repaired life is far stronger and more meaningful than one that has never faced a tear." Sitting in the cafe, I felt those words hit close to home. I thought about how quickly I gave up on difficult tasks, projects, or even friendships whenever they required hard work, patience, or repair. Repairing things takes time, but it builds character in a way that replacement never can. The Stone Carver of Kyoto. The next story took me across the world to a tranquil temple garden in Kyoto, Japan. Arthur had traveled there in his early 40s, seeking to understand the traditional arts of Japanese landscape design. In the outer courtyard of an ancient wooden temple, Arthur observed a stone carver named Master Kenji. Kenji was carving a large block of gray granite into a traditional stone lantern. Day after day, under the shade of giant maple trees, Kenji worked using only a small iron chisel and a wooden mallet. The work was astonishingly slow. Tap, tap, tap. Hour after hour, tiny specks of stone dust fell to the ground, but to an untrained eye, the heavy block of granite barely seemed to change shape from one day to the next. Arthur watched Kenji for 4 consecutive days. On the 4th afternoon, unable to contain his curiosity, Arthur asked the master how he maintained his focus and patience when the progress was so incremental and slow. Kenji lowered his hammer, wiped the stone dust from his brow, and looked at the granite block. He explained that he was not trying to force his vision onto the stone. Instead, he was listening to the stone. Every piece of rock had hidden fracture lines, grain patterns, and natural strengths. If he hit the stone too hard or worked too fast, the granite would shatter, ruined forever. Success required tapping the chisel with just enough force, over thousands of deliberate strikes, allowing the hidden form within the stone to reveal itself naturally. Kenji added that patience is not simply the ability to wait, it is the ability to maintain a calm, positive attitude while working towards something meaningful, no matter how long it takes. Arthur had noted, when we approach our personal goals, whether learning a new language, mastering a career, or healing our minds, we must act like the stone carver. Fast, aggressive force leads to burnout and broken effort. Gentle, consistent, daily effort shapes even the hardest rock over time. As I listened to the quiet rain falling outside the anchor and beam, I thought about my own journey with learning and personal growth. I remembered how often I had tried to force fast results, only to become frustrated and give up when things took longer than expected. Real growth, like stone carving, requires patience and soft consistency. The Winter Orchard. Another story in Arthur's leather notebook was set in the rolling hills of upstate New York on an apple orchard owned by a family for 4 generations. Arthur had spent a full winter staying on the farm to help the owner, a man named Samuel. During the deep winter months of January and February, the orchard was completely bare. The apple trees looked like dark, lifeless skeletons standing against the white, snow-covered ground. The air was freezing, and nothing seemed to be growing. To Arthur, the orchard seemed dead and barren. He asked Samuel why they bothered spending hours out in the freezing cold, pruning the dry, dead-looking branches when there was no sign of fruit anywhere. Samuel chuckled, his breath fogging in the crisp winter air. He explained that winter was actually the most critical season for the trees. Beneath the frozen soil, hidden from sight, the trees were resting and deep-rooting. The cold weather was necessary to trigger the tree's natural growth cycle. Furthermore, pruning the branches during winter allowed the tree to save its energy so that when spring arrived, the sunlight would reach the healthy wood, producing rich, sweet fruit. Samuel told Arthur that if a person only judged an orchard by what was visible in winter, they would chop down every tree thinking it was dead. But nature works in quiet, invisible cycles. Rest, bareness, and stillness are not signs of failure, they are the essential prerequisites for the harvest to come. Arthur's note below Samuel's words read, "Human lives also have seasons. There are times of bright summer abundance, but there are also long, quiet winters where nothing seems to be moving forward. Do not despair during your personal winter seasons. Trust the hidden work happening beneath the surface. Rest, prune away what is no longer needed, and prepare for your spring." This story filled me with a deep sense of relief. I realized that my own periods of feeling stuck or unproductive were not wasted time. They were simply quiet winter seasons meant for resting, reflecting, and preparing for the next phase of life. The desert night and the stars. Arthur's next journal entry brought me to the vast, empty expanse of the Mojave Desert in California. He had taken a solo camping trip into the desert to clear his mind after a difficult period in his life. He set up his tent miles away from any city lights, paved roads, or electrical grids. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting deep purple and crimson shadows across the sand dunes, darkness settled over the desert. At first, the darkness felt overwhelming and absolute. But as the hours passed and Arthur sat by his small campfire, his eyes gradually adjusted to the night. When he looked up at the sky, he was met with a breathtaking sight. Because there was no artificial city light to wash out the atmosphere, millions upon millions of stars blazed across the night sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of silver light. Arthur spent the entire night sitting wrapped in a warm blanket, gazing at the stars. In the absolute stillness of the desert night, he realized something profound. The stars were always there, shining with incredible brilliance every single night. But when living in the brightly lit city, surrounded by neon signs, street lamps, and glowing screens, people forget the stars exist. The artificial light hides the vastness of the universe. Arthur wrote in his journal, "Modern convenience and constant distraction act like artificial city lights. They fill our field of vision with bright, noisy, temporary things, completely hiding the vast, quiet truths of existence. Sometimes, we must step into the darkness and turn off the artificial lights of modern life so we can remember how infinite, beautiful, and vast the world truly is." Sitting in the warmth of the coffee shop, holding the notebook in my hands, I felt as though Arthur was speaking directly to my core. How many artificial lights was I allowing to blind me every day? How much noise was I letting into my life that prevented me from seeing the quiet, beautiful truths right in front of me? The Library of Forgotten Books. The penultimate chapter of the leather notebook took place in a small, ancient bookstore tucked away on a cobblestone alley in Boston, Massachusetts. The shop was owned by an elderly woman named Clara, who had kept the store open for over 60 years. The shelves were packed from floor to ceiling with thousands of second-hand books, smelling of old leather, ink, and history. Clara did not have a computer, an automated register, or an online catalog. Every book was logged by hand in a large ledger. Arthur asked Clara how she managed to run a business in an age where people preferred buying digital books instantly with the click of a button. Clara smiled warmly, leaning against her dark wooden counter. She said that people came to her shop not just to acquire information, but to experience discovery. When you search for a book online, you only find what you are already looking for. But when you walk slowly through a room filled with physical books, pulling down old volumes, turning thick paper pages, and smelling the print, you discover ideas, stories, and wisdom you never knew you needed. She explained that fast efficiency narrows a person's horizon, making them focus only on their immediate target. Slow exploration, however, broadens the mind, leading to unexpected encounters, creative insights, and serendipitous discoveries. Arthur noted, efficiency gives us what we ask for, but slowness gives us what we need. When we allow ourselves the freedom to wander, browse, and explore without a strict destination, we open the door to true wisdom. Returning to the present. I finally reached the last page of the leather notebook. I looked up. The cafe had grown quiet as the morning rush subsided. Outside, the rain had completely stopped, and bright rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the damp harbor streets. Arthur was sitting quietly, holding his coffee mug, watching me with a warm, patient expression. When he asked what I had discovered in those pages, I closed the leather book gently, feeling a sense of stillness inside me that I had not experienced in years. I told him I realized I had been running through my life, thinking that moving fast meant achieving more, when I was actually missing the very experience of living. Arthur nodded slowly and said that was the great paradox of modern life. We rush through today to reach tomorrow, but when tomorrow comes, we rush through it to reach the next day. We spend our entire lives preparing to live without ever living in the present moment. He reached across the table, picked up the faded leather notebook, and slid it into his coat pocket. He reassured me that I did not need to move to a cabin in the woods to find peace. I simply needed to introduce moments of slowness into my day. Walking a little slower, listening a little more closely, eating without distractions, and speaking with intention. Arthur stood up, buttoned his heavy wool coat, adjusted his cap, and tipped it toward me with a quiet smile. He told me to keep practicing, reminding me that English, life, and peace all belong to those who take their time. As the bell above the door chimed softly and Arthur stepped out into the morning air, I sat back in my chair. I took a deep, clear breath. I did not open my laptop or check my phone. I simply took a sip of my coffee, looked out at the bright sunlight on the ocean water, and allowed myself to just be right there in that moment. Listening to clear, deliberate English spoken at an unhurried pace allows your brain time to process words, feel rhythms, and absorb deep meanings without stress or confusion. When you practice English in this calm, focused way, you build genuine confidence, expand your vocabulary naturally, and sharpen your listening skills step by step. Thank you for spending this time with me on Explore English Podcast. Take a slow, deep breath, enjoy the beauty of this day, and remember to move through your life with intention, presence, and calm patience.